Professor Kirk Hawkins is professor of political science at Brigham Young University. He teaches comparative politics with an emphasis in Latin America. He's an affiliated faculty with the Kennedy Center's Latin American Studies and International Relations hosted programs. His recent publications include The Ideational Approach in Populism, Concept Theory and Analysis through Routledge, Contemporary U.S. Populism in Comparative Perspective through Cambridge University Press, Measuring Populist Discourse in the 2018 U.S. presidential election through Nature, Human Behavior, among others. Timely for our topic as well as what is going on currently. His current research focuses on political organization and populism. He directs Team Populism, a global scholarly network studying populism's causes and consequences. He was recently featured this research in The Guardian, which with his team of student researchers combed through speeches of 140 world leaders to gauge the rise of populism, which has doubled since the early 2000s. Other projects include the creation of a global populism data set, experiential research in populism's rhetorical mechanisms, and the mitigation of populism's polarizing consequences for society. Professor Hawkins received a PhD from Duke University and a BA and MA from the Kennedy Center in International Relations and Area Studies. He was a Mary Lou Fulton Young Scholar, honored by the College of Family, Home, and Social Sciences. Please join us in a warm Zoom and online welcome for Professor Kirk Hawkins, who will be speaking today about populism and challenges to democracy.
Well, Corey, thank you for that really generous welcome. It's good to be here back in some of my old haunts. As you heard, I was an undergrad and did a master's here in the old Kennedy Center program. And today I want to share what I think is some really important research about the broader theme of the Kennedy Center lecture series this semester, Challenges to Democracy, and one of the most significant challenges, which is populism. This is where the crucial test comes. Does the new system work? The answer is maybe. There we go. Okay, I think we've got that working. Great. So I wanted to talk first about a couple of cases here that will help you understand the problem, the concern here about populism and democracy. So I'm starting with a case that's important and relevant, especially in light of last night's presidential debate. So some of these concerns might be fresh on your minds. So critics of Donald Trump here in America and elsewhere will call him a populist. You may have heard that word used to describe him. And they'll often associate that populism with some of what they see these negative things he does for democracy in the United States. For example, how he maligns our free press, the ways he undermines the independence of some of our branches of government, including, say, the judiciary or the Department of Justice, the impact he's having on undermining confidence in elections, and concerns that some of those things might end up being tactics to enhance the Republican vote in the upcoming election. And those concerns are heightened if we think about other countries in which populists have in fact done things like that. So again, there we go, Viktor Orban in Hungary, another populist, in fact, somewhat more populist than Donald Trump. I'll talk about Hugo Chavez later. Or Recep Erdogan, the president of Turkey. And again, in both cases, leaders that are more populist than Donald Trump and have done significant damage to their country's democratic institutions, whether it's undermining the independence of their judiciaries, repressing their opponents, and so forth. But now, perhaps you say, I'm kind of a fan of Donald Trump, and I feel like you're maybe attacking me a little bit. What about those Democrats? Well, sure, let's talk about them. So we could mention a couple of candidates in the recent Democratic primaries, Bernie Sanders or Elizabeth Warren. Both of them also populist. In fact, probably more populist than Donald Trump. And so maybe we have similar concerns. What if they had won their party's nomination and then won the general election? Would they have done some damage to our country's democracy? And that concern is made, again, a little more real if we think about, say, left populists in other countries like Hugo Chavez in Venezuela, someone who, together with his successor, Nicolas Maduro, has done tremendous damage to that country's democratic institutions, let alone the economy and the ability of government to provide basic services for its citizens. Leaders who are extremely populist. So, populism and maybe challenges to democracy. I'm going to try to answer 3 questions about that today. First, of course, we should step back a little bit and say, well, what is populism? I've been using the word without making clear what I mean. Once I explain that, though, I also want to answer the question, in fact, is it bad? Bad for democracy especially. And then finally, to give a note of maybe some hope or optimism, what could we do about that? I'll tell you the answers already. I hope this won't seem too flippant, but populism is a political discourse. Yes, it's bad, and you can do a little about it depending on some things I'll talk about. But let's go over these at a little more length. So first, what is populism? Now, as I just said, I use this phrase, a discursive frame. That, of course, begs the question, what do I mean by that? It sounds pretty jargony, and it is. When I say a discursive frame, or another way to talk about it just as a political discourse, I'm suggesting that there's a set of ideas, that populism is a kind of ideas that's different from our traditional ideologies. So if I were to ask you what your political ideology is, you might have an answer for that. You know roughly what I was talking about. Terms like conservative, liberal, socialist, references to political ideologies, you probably have a kind of a sense of what those mean. In contrast, if I asked, well, what's your discursive frame right now? You wouldn't know that. So this is a set of ideas that's less familiar. We talk about how it's not consciously articulated. People will have a discursive frame in their mind and be speaking it without knowing it. More specifically, a discursive frame is, if it helps to think of it this way, I know when I was in international relations, we would talk about this idea of actors on a kind of global stage. Well, we could think about politics generally as a kind of work of theater on a stage. And so if politics is that stage, what kind of work are we seeing there? And who are the actors on that stage right now? They could be nations or nation states, like we would talk about in international relations, but they could also be citizens or the people. We could also ask ourselves whether there are good guys on the stage and whether there are villains as well. Ultimately, what kind of work is it we're looking at? Is this some sort of comedy? Is it a grand historical drama? Do we imagine what kind of work is it? Let me then go on and say what populism is specifically as a discursive frame. So if this is a kind of a work on the stage of politics, it's one where we imagine that politics is some kind of cosmic struggle between, here are the actors, on the one side a good guy, the will of the common people, and a bad guy, the conspiring elite. And the idea then is when you see politics that way, you're thinking and maybe speaking populism. And when a politician does that too, we can call them populist as well. So populism is just one kind of political discourse. Others would include pluralism, which is a view where, imagine again a different work on the stage, where there is no villain, and instead it's maybe some kind of a family drama where we confront some impersonal challenges and circumstances, but there's good in all of us, and in the end, we'll get together and resolve them. Instead, maybe we have the same actors on the stage of the people and the elite, but we reverse their roles, and we imagine that the elite is the good guy and the people is the bad guy. Nationalism would be one more familiar in international relations, where we think of that stage being populated by nations instead by our countries. So different discourses, each of which expresses a view about how it imagines sovereignty, who is in power, who should be, ultimately then a kind of a vision of how politics works. And within that then they can have specific issues and ideologies to go with that. So populism, as we'll say in a moment, can be on the left or the right. It's a way of framing those issues and ideologies. All right, let me give you some examples here. We're going to try this out, see how this works in our online medium. And we're going to do this with 2 examples. First, with a piece of a campaign commercial from Donald Trump in 2016. This was actually his closing campaign commercial. And I'm just going to see how this works. This is going to be tricky. And because I'll not have the ability to manipulate these very well. Let me see. No. Okay, let's just try this first one. I think the Trump video is going to be a little easier. And we'll try this. There we go.
Our movement is about replacing a failed and corrupt political establishment with a new government controlled by you, the American people. The establishment has trillions of dollars at stake in this election. For those who control the levers of power in Washington and for the global special interest, they partner with these people that don't have your good in mind. The political establishment that is trying to stop us is the same group responsible for our disastrous trade deals, massive illegal immigration, and economic and foreign policies that have bled our country dry. The political establishment has brought about the destruction of our factories and our jobs as they flee to Mexico, China, and other countries all around the world. It's a global power structure that is responsible for the economic decisions that have robbed our working class, stripped our country of its wealth, and put that money into the pockets of a handful of large corporations and political entities. The only thing that can stop this corrupt machine is you. The only force strong enough to save our country is us.
Okay, now if this reader is manipulated, I would also show you an Elizabeth Warren video. We'll have to do without that one. But let's point out some features of that Trump campaign commercial. So again, this question, well, was he speaking populism there? If you're like me, I heard some very distinctly populist things. Now, to be clear, on the one hand, there was some kind of nationalism talk. He talks about other countries as doing things to harm our country. But then he also talks a lot about the people, especially right there at the end. You know, the only thing that can stop this is you, the American people. This sort of pictures of ordinary working Americans who are gonna stop this thing. And who's the thing they're gonna stop? Well, it's an establishment. And for him, the establishment consists of, interestingly, there's a bit of Wall Street and global economic powers and organizations, but also, of course, say, liberals, leaders of the Democratic Party. So Trump is expressing a strong populist rhetoric in that speech. By the way, interesting to note that as we look at Trump elsewhere, we found, and we'll show you in a second how this works, that he's actually kind of sometimes populist and sometimes not. And typically, he's most populist in speeches that are written by other people and not where he speaks extemporaneously. Interesting thing, we could talk more about that at another time. Again, we're going to skip the Elizabeth Warren video. Let's see if we can do that. There we go. And instead, I want to say what we've done is to try to systematize this work and go beyond this kind of impressionistic take on what politicians are saying in a speech. And we've analyzed the text of speeches across many leaders. And in the introduction, Corey Leonard referred to some of our work there, the database we have, the Global Populism database, and some work we presented in The Guardian. This actually shows some of that work from The Guardian, looking at a large number of world leaders, presidents and prime ministers, and there are so many, it's probably impossible to read their names as you look at this online. What it shows you is from a scale from 0 to 2, how populist they are. 2 is the maximum. And up at the top end, we have leaders like Hugo Chavez. At the low end, we have some other leaders that may be more obscure to you. Dilma Rousseff, the previous president in Brazil, Donald Tusk from Poland. Much more moderate figures in a lot of ways and not very populist as we analyze their speeches. Donald Trump, the gray bar, is actually right in the middle. So he's only moderately populist for some of the reasons I just mentioned. Sometimes he is, sometimes he isn't. He's a little inconsistent in his speaking. So, very interesting. Now, let me also point out that we've done some work looking at individual citizens. So, presumably, these ideas that exist in the speech of a politician could be found in your own minds. And we'd measure that with a survey. We did a version of this, an online version with our Guardian project, The New Populism. I'm so reluctant to show this to you because right now, every one of you are going and Googling this thing to see, oh, populism quiz, The Guardian. Because this survey, you can go in right now, it's still live, and find out how populist you are, and it compares your populism as well as your kind of left-right ideology with other world leaders. Let me say, try not to do it right now if you can. Save it for the end. It's very engaging, but I want you to see the rest of what we've got here. And one of these is some of the results we've found as we look across countries at average levels of populist attitudes. And a very important finding as we look across countries. So here are 12 countries over the past few years. And the horizontal bar there shows the mean level. And on the left, that scale is the absolute scale from 0 to 1. And as you can see from that, most countries actually have very similar levels of populist attitudes, and they're pretty high. That leads to a puzzle for us, which is why would most people have populist attitudes? As I like to say sometimes, there's a little Hugo Chavez in you and me. And why would that be so common, and yet we obviously don't elect populists every day? And that's a different question that we analyze in our work, where we look at the causes of populism, talking about how those attitudes in each of us get activated by the context around us. But for now, the takeaway, populism in many ways is at least at that individual level, kind of common. It's a discourse, a discursive frame that's in most of our heads already. All right, so is that all bad? Yeah, why is that bad? Why is it harmful for democracy? Populism, in fact, has some strengths. I'd be remiss if I didn't point these out. First of all, if you think about what populism is doing, it's an argument that people are making that they've been ignored, that their views have been sidelined by a political elite that's sort of systematically not taking them into account. And so presumably then, as a populist movement appears and it's giving voice to that group that feels like it's been marginalized, that's going to help change the political agenda, especially if that movement or party is a strong one that threatens the other parties, or more so, of course, if it wins office. That's not a bad thing. If there is a group out there that has been marginalized, it's good to have their concerns brought back into the political agenda, the policy agenda, as we try to decide what our government should be doing. A second consequence that scholars have talked about is that it can increase participation in probably the most obvious way, by increasing voting. Populists will do this, first of all, just by giving people a sense of empowerment, but it can also organize them. And if a populist takes power, it may engage in an effort to register new voters and get them out. Populism also has the effect of increasing the stakes of electoral competition. And if you're the opposition, you feel like, I've really got to get out and vote to oppose this populist. We saw this here in the US with our midterm congressional elections just a year or two ago, in which we had some of the highest turnout for a congressional election that we've had in decades. It was incredible. Well, the concern over a populist leader was helping drive that. So participation in a multitude of ways can go up, turnout being an important one. At the same time, populism has some clear weaknesses, areas where it damages specifically democratic institutions. And think again about what the populist rhetoric is arguing. It says that there's one good way of doing things that is what the people would surely want. Well, if you believe that, then for you, elections really aren't about a competitive race out of which comes the best idea. Instead, it's about finding and expressing the unique popular will. So competition isn't really that important. And if we need to break rules that violate the free or the fairness of that competition in order to express what we think is the popular will better, so be it. That means then we're willing to break election rules as we go along. We can make elections increasingly unfair and justify it because we're doing it in the name of the people. Likewise, if we see our opponents as evil, even as devils, certainly not really as full citizens, something less than human perhaps, then it's easier to restrict their civil liberties and take away some of their rights. But also we may feel like we have to, because that's a powerful elite that in the past has subverted our democracy, and we've got to keep them from doing that again. So again, we do that any way we need to. The media often suffers here precisely because they are going to do things that may criticize that populist leader, and that populist leader doesn't take it very well because he's speaking the will of the people. Why should they oppose him? Finally, when populism comes in the form of a charismatic leader, as it usually does when it wins power, when it takes control of the presidency or the government under a parliamentary system, it tends to undermine checks and balances because the supporters see that leader as embodying our popular will. And if that leader embodies that will, why on earth should we let other branches of government stand in the way of that leader doing what he's supposed to make sure that that will is made into law and that government laws are being enforced in ways that the people want. So the legislature, the judicial branch should all be rendered subservient to that chief executive. We undermine checks and balances then as a result of populism. Now, there are a few maybes here. Populism is often associated with a couple of sort of types of policies that we sometimes define populism as these leaders that have short-sighted macroeconomic policies, left populists, if you will. And on the other hand, today especially, we may think of populists on the right as fomenting intolerance, especially towards ethnic minorities and other groups. And while populism can do that, and there's a sense that the populist ideas may kind of radicalize our positions, the fact is we can have populisms of all kinds, and so we try not to associate populism with any one issue position because, yeah, as we've seen before with these examples, Democrats and Republicans, we can have all kinds of populism. So it's not really consistently associated with any set of macroeconomic policies or any kind of authoritarian or intolerant policies. All right, so that's all, though, in theory. And you may be asking, well, yeah, but really, I mean, what evidence can you give us of this beyond some of the anecdotes I've shared? Well, let me go into one case to start with, and this is the case of Hugo Chavez, whom I've already mentioned, president of Venezuela from 1999 to 2013. And Chavez is very populist. Again, as you saw earlier, is right at the top of the charts. So we could well ask then, well, what did he do to his country's democracy? And give a little detail there. On the one hand, there were some good things he did. We could call these good things. So voter turnout under Chavez actually went up by 30%, and it was very directly connected to his populist message. He galvanized voters. He excited them and gave them a sense of being empowered. He also had the government pay to register voters, and they tried to get them out. So this is part of an active effort, and furthermore, it was partly the result of an opposition that felt like it had to turn out to vote as well in order to oppose him. That increase of 30% is enormous. We normally don't see increases that large, and Chavez, that's really happened, and we can link this pretty directly to that populist message. Chavez also espoused new forms of direct democracy, and he would justify these in populist terms as ways of getting the will of the people really expressed politically. And so the new constitution they passed under him in 1999 included extraordinary provisions like the recall of presidents. You could have recall elections against the president, which in fact the opposition then used. In 2004 in an attempt to oust Chavez. They were unsuccessful. Chavez ended up winning the recall election and staying in power. But again, direct democracy in order to express the popular will. And the Chavez government also created a number of organizations to sort of defend the rights of poor people and help them govern themselves within their communities. This included, for example, efforts to extend health care to poor neighborhoods, to extend land rights to the landless. So a lot of efforts to really give poor people a voice, people that they sensed had not really been included under the previous government policies. On the other hand, the government routinely abused the public funds for elections. I would see this when I'd go down, and for the elections, you'd look at a government building, let's say a police station or a government executive agency, and on the building would be this enormous banner saying basically, vote for Chavez. It's something that it's hard to imagine that being tolerated. That seems really wrong. Government funds and government installations shouldn't be used like that to campaign for the incumbent, but they were routinely. In addition, we see a real decline in media freedom in all forms of media. We talk about the press or broadcast journalism. Chavez didn't like what a lot of these private media were saying about him, and so they would use the government to take away broadcasting licenses of stations that oppose them, to force the owners to sell the station. They would engage in censorship of print journalism. So this was a significant decline under Chavez, and again, he'd do this, he would vilify the leaders, the journalists, by saying, you're the enemies of the people. The president ruled by decree. Most of the time that Chavez was in power, the Congress would just say, you know what, we don't really need to worry about us legislating. We're just going to grant you decree powers of 6 months, a year, 2 years. And of course, that then denied the opposition the opportunity to, contend with these bills that were being proposed. The president would just kind of present it, and it was done. And finally, remember those organizations and policies I meant that help poor people? Turns out that they mostly went just to his supporters. And so even those good things were not as good as they seemed at the time. All right, that's one case. But what about generally? We looked at, and I'm looking at a basically blank graph here. But we'll make this work. Let me see if the others are the same. Yeah, okay. So as we transfer these slides, some of the dots are missing. There are dots all over these graphs. What they're showing you is the data that we collected on the level of populism of chief executives around the globe. And so along the bottom, the populism score is measuring that from 0 to 2, left to right. And then we look at these indicators, quantitative indicators for a global data set on the same kinds of things we talked about for Hugo Chavez. So here we look at voter turnout. And the average effect of populism on voter turnout, it turns out, is not just Venezuela experienced that. Now, Venezuela, you can actually see the label for the dot in the upper right. Venezuela is, in fact, an extreme case with that 30% increase. But we have other countries in Latin America, such as Ecuador and Bolivia, that under populists experience similar increases. So the effect seems to be more general. We can also look at, say, press freedom, and this is a measure that comes from Freedom House. Again, the populism score is the same, but on the left, the measure is going to go that lower numbers mean lower press freedom. And so you see, oh yeah, once again, press freedom declines under populists. Venezuela, again, an extreme case, but we have other countries like Ecuador, Belarus, that also we see these kinds of decreases. Again, there are a lot of dots on these graphs that just didn't come through in the transfer of the file. Checks and balances, a measure of whether that power is being concentrated in the chief executive, the executive branch, or dispersed among all the branches. And again, we see, and this is measured in so the scale here, lower numbers mean the checks and balances are being reduced. That is, the power is being concentrated. And again, populism results globally in this problem. Venezuela isn't even the most extreme case there. And finally, just looking at a more broad measure of democracy, one that reflects more the quality and fairness of elections. Again, declining consistently under populists across the globe. So these are more general problems. We see these consistent effects of populism across the globe. And it happens whether these are left or right. It really isn't particular to the ideology of these populists. Okay, so what should we do about that? And I want to take a few minutes here now at the end and say if there are ways of mitigating this. Well, how can you respond? And one of the thing I'll say before I get into the strategy, because I had mentioned at the very beginning, it depends. You can, but it depends on who you are. So I was thinking here of our member of Congress for the district here that we live in, John Curtis. And Congressman Curtis is actually, on the one hand, he's in a position of power, if you will. He's there in Congress. He can try to legislate and maybe do something on a grand national scale that would respond to populists. He himself is not particularly populist. But at the individual or interpersonal level, there's something he can do. And he actually does this very well. Congressman Curtis loves town hall meetings. And when he goes to these meetings, he just thrives there. And he has a lot of constituents may be very angry at the meeting, some of them, in fact, expressing populist views. And yet he's able to respond in a way that's very effective and kind of lowers the tension. They listen to him. They come out of it respecting him. That's a model of the kind of thing we can do at a more interpersonal level. So we can be like John Curtis, maybe not in passing laws, but in the way we interact with our family, friends, and neighbors. So there's a communication strategy I want to suggest for you as you engage with populists. 3 components to that: how you listen, how you speak, and how you build. So listening, how does that work? This is an illustration from a pamphlet that came from the opposition, the Turkish opposition party, the CHP, the Republican People's Party in Turkey. As they opposed President Erdogan, most recently in municipal elections, they came up with this very interesting strategy that they called radical love. And it was a strategy of non-confrontation, of just trying to listen to their opponents, and especially to voters who had been or maybe still were in favor of Erdogan. and they felt like this would do a better job of engaging with them. So this is a cartoon from their pamphlet translated into English. Two men in a cafe. One says, "I really like this man." Or, "Really, what did he say?" Nothing. It captures this idea of how we should listen to someone who may be expressing populist views to us. How should you do that? Well, counseling psychologists would say you need to engage in active, empathetic listening. And what that means specifically is you would listen to somebody intently with a view to understand what they're saying, and then here's the catch, you would want to be able to repeat to them what it was they had been telling you to express, as you understand it, their views or their experiences in a way that they are then satisfied you've got it. And so once you're able to do that, you've done it. You've listened enough to understand their views in a way that they feel understood. That's really important because if you think about what a populist is doing, he's approaching a political conflict by saying, there's a struggle here. I've not been listened to. I've not been given my full rights as a citizen. And so you can combat that in this way, subtly, by saying, in fact, I'm going to dignify you by listening to you and trying to understand your grievances in your own terms. That's hard to do. We may not like what they're saying. We probably have strong views in opposition to that, but you have to stop and try to understand what their concerns are to be able to get at their grievances. The second step here I mentioned is talking. And what you see on that screen is not a Roman numeral 1, it's the word I. So if you've taken any marriage therapy, you may have heard this phrase, use I statements. So when you talk about your concerns or the problems you see, instead of generalizing them, you admit that they are ultimately your experience and your perception of things. I feel this way. I'm concerned about this. This is really important to do and reflects the kinds of strategies we should engage in as we talk to people who are in a very populist mood. Because we can talk in a way that attacks them, or we can talk in a way that expresses a little more humility and care and avoids, say, demonizing or labeling them. So don't come to that conversation, well, all you Democrats think this. It's just the wrong thing to do. Now, again, the populists may not be doing that to you. They may be speaking those generalities to you. They may be labeling you. You can't do it in response. Instead, use I statements as you talk. Finally is the idea of building, how we build. And this graphic here is actually meant to be, get this. So we build policy on top of our common values. Get it? One on top of the other. Yeah, that was my best way of expressing that in this slide. The idea is that the listening and the talking ultimately allows us to understand where we maybe have some common values or concerns. For example, if I'm talking to a populist who's expressing strong anti-immigrant views, I can explore this further, and as I do, I'll probably find out that some of his concerns may be racist, and I don't feel, I can't share that with him. But on the other hand, I'd say some of your concerns seem to be about following the law and having communities where the rule of law is respected and where citizens in particular have certain rights, not just duties, but rights, and that those rights are greater than non-citizens, and that's really important. So if you're able to see that and realize that part of their grievance is something that, in fact, you share and can respect, the next step is to not just leave it at cheap talk, but to try to look for policy solutions, ideas that would build on that common ground. As you heard with that example, you'd probably be able to do that even if you were very pro-immigrant. You would still, I think, appreciate the value of the rule of law and respecting rights of citizens as we do that. And so allowing them to articulate those views, showing them respect, but then also taking the common ground and turning it into something really concrete is important because it says in the end, I really do value what you said, and is an important way of diffusing the populism that they're feeling right now. All right, so let's wrap up and summarize here what I've said. The first thing is, populism is, what is it? An unusual set of ideas that, in fact, many of us feel and express. There's a little Hugo Chavez in all of us, and quite a few populist leaders around the globe, although not all of them are by any measure. Second, populism does have these negative consequences. It leads citizens and politicians to do some very undemocratic things, and importantly, the data across the globe show this consistently, and it shows it for the left and the right. Finally, I hope this gives you a little hope. We can respond more effectively to populism, especially by how we engage with populists, our friends, neighbors, at an interpersonal level. There's a lot that we can do about how we talk and interact with them. And out of that may, in fact, come some really good policy solutions. So it can be a productive experience, even if it's pretty difficult to be able to listen and talk with somebody who has strong populist views. Finally, I just say to conclude this, don't be a populist. I mean, if there are real problems in our society, in our country, in our community, we need to recognize those and work to solve them. But populism is ultimately, there's a bit of paranoia to it as we demonize our opponents instead of just recognizing our differences of opinions. It's tempting to engage in your own kind of populism. Don't do it. Thank you.
All right, thank you very much. Lots of claps for you on Zoom. We will now, we have a few minutes for question and answer, and invite you to post your questions in the chat on Zoom. The first question comes from Madeline. Madeline says, the definition of populism makes me think of communism, which also tries to define a struggle between the virtuous people and the evil upper class. How are populism and communism related or different?
Madeline, that's a great question and a good example. On the one hand, when we talk about communism, and I think here you mean it primarily as an ideology. And so right then I think, well, it's not going to be equivalent. Communism is, as an ideology, it's something that people consciously articulated. There are books that I can go out and read. And if you ask me, are you a communist? I'd be able to say, well, no, of course not, because I know what that word means. So in that sense, I would expect them to be a little different. But you've hit on some important similarities. In practice, what we found, and we have as part of our exercises in studying populist discourse and speeches, we've looked at the speeches of some communist leaders like Fidel Castro or Vladimir Lenin or Stalin. And what we find in practice is that some communists actually do use populist framing to talk about the struggle between the proletariat and the capitalists. So some of them do that, and so when they do that, right, they're really demonizing the capitalists. They're imagining them as being in charge of everything. It's a very conspiratorial way of seeing things. But on the other hand, many communists will speak a little differently, and instead of celebrating the will of the common people as what should be sovereign, they'll instead talk about how we should follow what the party says. And so on their stage, they now have a different actor, and it's the Communist Party. And for them, the Communist Party is the ultimate authority. And so that's also possible within a possibility by those using a communist ideology. So they're not all populists. Some are, but a lot of them aren't. And again, you want to look at their rhetoric to see, do they really celebrate the people? Do they sort of romanticize the common people as our sovereign or not?
Other questions from our audience? While you're thinking and typing in questions, so it seems like we're in a populist moment. What does your research show in terms of an overall trend, and why are we seeing this now, or is it something that we just haven't been paying attention to?
It's a little bit the latter. If you think historically, we can probably all identify populist movements from the past. And in a lot of cases, we aren't able to really fully identify them just because we haven't studied the record of their speeches and what they said. When we have looked at it, though, we've found that some examples that can go into the distant past, say in the United States, we'd think of the progressives of the early 1900s, George Wallace and his movement in the 60s and 70s, Pat Buchanan, Ross Perot. Going further back instead into the 19th century, we could think about literally the Populist or People's Party that ran in the 1890s. We could go earlier than that to, say, the Know-Nothings in the 1840s, and even Andrew Jackson had a lot of populism in his speeches. So what's going on with that? And the answer is populism has actually been around a while, and is probably best thought of as something that's inherent to democracy. So if I believe in popular sovereignty, But maybe I'm also getting upset about injustices around me, and I start to imagine someone's responsible for those problems. It's really easy to adopt a populist frame. So a populist frame probably just comes with a belief in popular sovereignty. So then the question is more, okay, so it's probably been around a lot, and maybe why does it get expressed sometimes but not others? Now, you also asked a question about whether this is a populist moment that we're living in. In some ways it is. As we've looked at our global data for the past 20 years, we've seen that there has been an uptick, but it's mostly in Western Europe where we see the increase. So the United States has actually had populist movements repeatedly throughout our history. The examples I was giving you help highlight that. So if it's kind of always there, why, maybe a better question is why Western Europe didn't experience more populism post-war. Why so many countries would go 40 or 50 or 60 years before they would finally see successful populists reemerge. In fact, if we look at their past, say, in the interwar years between World War I and II, we do see more populist movements. And we see them, say, in a country like France, going back in time all the way to the French Revolution. So it's actually, it's kind of cyclical and recurring. And I think that perspective helps, at least in the way that it helps me say, oh, okay, well, so it sort of comes and goes. And I shouldn't feel like it's something new and permanent that's just going to take over the world. That's not right. It's also important to recognize there are differences across countries and regions. So populism comes to power in a big way, say, in countries with a lot of corruption. In the region like Latin America that I study. Whereas in Europe or the United States, it tends to be a third-party phenomenon. It's usually milder when it appears, and it just isn't usually, there aren't 60% of the voters trying to vote for a populist.
We have one more question from Chloe. Chloe asks, why do more populist movements happen with war?
Chloe, I'm not sure if you're asking if they cause war or if war causes them. There is a sense that populism leads to conflict within countries. So populism polarizes us. Instead of people reacting with the nice strategy of engagement I described, we instead tend to react in a very hostile way. We shout something back at them. You're ignorant, you're savages, and you're demagogues. And so when we do that, we start to demonize each other, and then we see the country beginning to polarize. We're experiencing that in the United States right now. Although we had some of that polarization going on for a long time, the Trump campaign and him in the presidency has actually really increased that a lot. So populism can do that. And the concern then is as that polarization grows, I mean, what's next? Do we actually, is there violence that follows? Can this lead to civil war? In practice, we haven't seen populist movements that usually last more than a few years. It's rare to have someone in power as long as, say, Chavez was in Venezuela. And so we usually don't see it play out quite that much. But we do have countries that got pretty bad. Argentina is a good example of this, populist movement under Juan Domingo Perón in the 1940s. And it never really goes away. The conflict, that division, persists in Argentina today and is a source of conflict, thankfully not usually violent conflict. So we know populism polarizes. There's a concern it can lead to conflict, maybe even civil war, although thankfully it doesn't usually get that far.
Another question from Elizabeth Curate, who you should be able to see on the screen now. Elizabeth says, we're seeing a lot of polarization between political parties here in the US right now. Is this all due to populism? How do you see this playing out in the future, and what do you think could be done in the future on the national scale to find more common ground? Polarization being an issue that we hear almost as much as populism.
Yeah, and polarization, again, populism isn't the only cause of polarization. I mentioned that it has made it worse here in the United States, but it was pre-existing. There were ideological differences that have been growing since the 1960s here in America. So we don't want to lay all the blame on populism, but recognize that it does have an impact. And in that sense, then I think the strategy I was mentioning at the end is the kind of thing that we could be doing on a larger scale. There are actually a number of organizations right now that are engaged in these depolarization efforts. Some of them I think don't quite hit it right because they emphasize too much the prejudices or ignorance of the populists, which I think is not the healthiest way to approach populists and bring them to a conversation. But others, and I'm a big fan of the work that Braver Angels does, where they have some really nice workshops that try to teach you skills of conversation, a lot like what I was showing you here, and try to do that in kind of a mass way. And so you can get involved in those. There's a lot of effort at community outreach. Most of these organizations have some kind of presence right even here in Utah Valley. And you can go, and that's actually an important way to help beyond, say, what you would do, in conversations with members of your family. So I think that there is a little more that all of us, especially as students and faculty here at BYU, we have the ability to do.
All right, I think that's it. Please join me in thanking once again Professor Kirk Hawkins for a wonderful lecture today.
You're very welcome.
Thanks for your patience with the technology. We're going to get better as the semester goes on, and encourage you to come back next week and look forward to Professor Jacob Rue as a continuation of our series on democracy. Thanks again.